wannabe senators on the attack. Is it doing any good or just turning voters off? Plus, back to school in the coronavirus era. How do we do it? And slowing down the return to normal as COVID-19 cases speed up across Kansas. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.
Welcome to Kansas Week. I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. This week, confirmed infections from the coronavirus continue to climb in Kansas. One study showing the state now tied for 13th in the nation, both for the fastest spread of the virus and for the least number of restrictions, all leading to renewed calls to slow down reopening and to put a mask on.
The nearly 3,500 new cases in the past 2 weeks is the steepest rate of increase we have seen since the pandemic.
The governor called for Kansas to remain in phase 3 of the state's Ad Astra recommended reopening plan, saying most of those cases have come from clusters that started at places like long-term care facilities, sporting events, and bars and restaurants.
Here's a very important note. There are no clusters at this time connected to barbershops, nail salons, or any other close contact service. That is not a coincidence. It is more proof that masks and hygienic business practices do indeed work.
Staying at phase 3 would include things like keeping groups to fewer than 45 people, maintaining social distancing rules, and following strict personal hygiene.
My responsibility as the governor of this state is to honestly assess and confront this pandemic, regardless of the political consequences.
This came after many counties chose not to endorse her statewide masking mandate, leaving it only as a recommendation. But some cities picked up where their counties left off by passing their own masking ordinances. That includes Wichita, Winfield, and Salina. This brought a counter-protest to the home of Wichita Mayor Brandon Whipple over the weekend as a handful of people gathered to share their anger over the city's new ordinance, calling it a violation of their rights.
Nobody should be fined for going out in public without a mask. That is their own responsibility, their own choice, whether they're going to wear a mask or not. We don't need the government to micromanage our decisions.
While some state lawmakers called the city ordinances unconstitutional as well, the state's top lawyer, Derek Schmidt, disagreed. In a written statement, his spokesman, Clinton Blaze, said, "To the best of our knowledge, the legislature has not enacted state law that prohibits cities from enacting local ordinances that regulate the wearing of face masks." And there's a lot to dissect in that. Let's get right to it with this week's panel. Here on the desk with me, we have Lisa Edwards with the localnewschannel.org, an online Wichita site. And joining us by Skype is Dr. Michael Smith, a political scientist from Emporia State University. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to start with you, Michael. We have heard a lot from doctors. They seem to be near unanimous at this point that masks are the best thing we can do to keep the economy open, to keep people being able to go out and do business without spreading the virus too quickly. Why is there still such a strong opposition to it at this point?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We've been hearing for months, when is the economy going to reopen? When is the economy going to reopen? And while it can't reopen fully, there is a plan in Kansas and in other states to reopen to the best of our ability, and it involves wearing masks in public. The gentleman that was featured at the protest made a very common argument we hear from the folks that resist this, and it's the idea that is associated with libertarianism. If an individual's decision affects only that individual, government should stay out of it. Unfortunately, that's problematic with masks because, as we know, with cloth masks, not maybe the medical grade N95 ones, but the cloth masks, their primary benefit is to protect other people from you if you are a carrier and don't know it when you exhale. They're not as effective at protecting you. They help a little, but mainly they protect others from you. So the argument doesn't really seem to apply. But it's become very partisan. President Trump, as you know, does not wear a mask, whereas Senator Biden does. Just a difference in political ideology. A lot of Republicans are very skeptical now of the professional class, which includes the epidemiologists and other scientists that are recommending that we do this.
So, Lisa, as you are covering this with your organization, what are you seeing amongst your followers?
Well, I guess as normal, it's a mixed thing. I'm really disheartened at the fact that there are more people out there that are joining the ranks of my choice, and since when did being healthy become something that was so horrible to think about? And if I want to keep you safe, I want to wear a mask. But we live in this time period where we don't care about each other. We care about self-interest. And there's a lot of people that are turning this into a hate crime kind of thing, to where, and I say hate crime loosely because it's done in hatred and it's a crime, these things that they're doing, from, people coming in and assaulting people in the coffee shops, like they said in Newsweek, where the men in Virginia did that. You got the LA Times, where the young lady was just simply like, hey, can you wear a mask? My neighbors, to protect all of us. And they want to throw up swastikas and be hateful and stuff. And it's just the time period where I feel like anything is going to make somebody act out if they're in that rebellion mode.
And Michael, that rebellion mode kind of brings to what you talked about, the hyperpartisanship, but there seems to be more to it than that.
Well, there does. It's some of the same drivers behind the partisanship. It's more like kind of root causes. And I really think that a lot of it is, back in the 20th century, the Republican Party was really the party of the professional class, white collar people. And I'm not to overgeneralize, where each individuals make our own choices. But in general, white collar people tended to favor the Republican Party. Just recently, we've seen a major shift in that the class that includes scientists, medical professionals, epidemiologists, and others mostly favors the Democrats, and that creates this partisan divide where the Republicans are very skeptical. Not all Republicans by any means. Some governors who are Republicans have actually been really strong on this, like in Rhode Island. But in general, there's a sense that they may not deny the existence of COVID-19, but they think they're not being told the whole truth. And there's a whole other subject, which is partisan news media. We're not getting our news from the same sources. So they're hearing news from sources that promote skepticism and doubt. And essentially the argument is scientists claim to know more than they actually do. I don't think that's true. I do think the mainstream media sometimes oversimplifies, but that's the message that mask refusers, who tend to be political conservatives, are hearing, and it reinforces their conviction. And let's face it, masks are uncomfortable, but they do save lives.
Uncomfortable is a good word for it. Now, when we spoke at the beginning of the show, we talked about the governor saying one reason for the masking order and the push to remain at phase 3 of reopening is to be sure kids can go back to school next month. Exactly how to do that is something schools are still working out, though the governor provided some clues as to what we can expect this week, as KAKE's Jessica Crawford shows us.
The state of Kansas is preparing for back to school amid a deadly pandemic.
We have a virus in here that can make our friends and our neighbors and our family members very sick and even kill them.
Governor Laura Kelly said Thursday that educators and public health officials are putting the finishing touches on a plan to return students and teachers to the classroom.
Is probably the most comprehensive and the most thoughtful plan for opening our schools safely and getting our kids back into an education process across the nation.
She says the plan will take into account the overall impact of coronavirus on the state of Kansas, as well as the impact on individual schools and classrooms. That way, responses can be tailored to hyper-local needs.
This is a combination plan of the best from education and the best from public health working together to make this happen.
And Lisa, the CDC's recommendations for reopening schools are pretty strict as far as temperature checks, social distancing, mask wearing. You and I were talking before the show, we both have kids, about different reactions to it and stuff. How feasible is it really to be able to open schools fully this fall as a parent?
You know, I watch the news just like any other person does, especially as a parent, like you said. And I appreciate that Governor Kelly is doing what she's doing and being concerned about it. You got to think over the summer, you have kids that are going to emulate what their parents have. And if their parents haven't been pushing for the mask to be worn, then they're coming back into school. There was a rumor about 1 week transition period. And I told my kids, you're going to have to miss out on a week of school because I'm not sending you there with God knows what and with who has this or that. I'm not really comfortable with that. I'd rather go online or, like we had discussed before, look into that hybrid plan of half and half.
And yet that's not always an option, Michael. Definitely we're dealing with different levels in different districts and even within a district of who can really afford to do what.
That is an excellent point, Pilar, an excellent point. Unfortunately, the working from home, even in the so-called blended format that you all are talking about, exacerbates inequalities. And I'll give you one example. A lot of lower income peoples are extremely dependent on their local public library for internet access. Internet at home, as we know, is expensive. It's a middle class luxury that many of us take for granted, but it's pricey. And lower income folks, they're not going to have that. And we've got the libraries on lockdown or with very limited access, very limited hours, which is denying that internet access. So then we migrate our classes online for good reason, because we want to stay safe. But unfortunately, we've got a whole population that do not have access to one of the only places where they can get reliable internet.
And that does bring us to what the governor was talking about, where the decision needs to be hyper-local for each district, even each building, because you've got children in different buildings, and each building has different requirements and different needs.
Right. To my understanding, they were actually looking into that, at least 259 was, and they were like, okay, there's going to be some lower income people that aren't going to be able to do that. So what they're going to do is try, from my knowledge, is try to implement some monies to where they can buy those things and have like all-time Wi-Fi or something to where these students can actually do that on laptops and, you know, do schooling like they're supposed to.
Certainly a lot of discussion going on around that right now, especially amongst teachers and administrators as they're trying to figure this all out. I think we're all on the edge of our seats waiting to see what they come up with.
Definitely.
Yeah, but there is some other stuff too. Much of this push for masks is also presented as a way to keep the economy going. Right now, the state faces a $1.3 billion shortfall because of the shutdown, and something the federal government should step in to fill that gap. KSN's Corinne Griffith asked the top 4 Republican candidates for U.S. Senate where they stand on that and other future stimulus monies.
Despite much of Kansas reopening, some people and small businesses are still struggling. So I asked the candidates if they would support a second round of federal financial aid. Negotiations in Congress are continuing on if another federal aid package should be sent out. This could include more money for individuals and businesses. Dr. Roger Marshall says only a third of the federal money has made it to people so far. He says Congress should wait on a second round of funding.
Let's wait and see where some of those monies end up, and maybe give some more flexibility to some of those monies where people can use them.
Dave Lindstrom says while he thinks the federal government should help those in need, he didn't like the way the money was sent out in the first stimulus package.
The money was being allocated to things that aren't necessarily stimulus related and coronavirus related. And for that, I would not be supportive.
Chris Kobach says the economy is doing well enough that more aid is unnecessary. But both he and Bob Hamilton agree that no federal money should go to bail out state governments.
I absolutely oppose using our tax dollars to subsidize the profligate spending of those blue states.
We're in debt up to our eyeballs. I don't think that we need to bail out governments.
Most Democrats are pushing for another federal aid package and support for state governments in debt due to the coronavirus pandemic. Next week, I'll hear what the candidates have to say about health care in the U.S. and what their plan is if they make it to the Senate. At the Capitol, I'm Corinne Griffith.
And Michael, the most interesting thing about that stuck out to me was candidates saying that they would not support money going to state governments to help with these deficits that they're facing. Is that really a tenable position right now when running for the Senate?
It may be politically tenable. I think Kobach, pushed the most buttons. He's good at pushing buttons, bringing up, well, we don't want to subsidize the blue states, and he even found a way to work immigration in there, believe it or not. That wasn't in the quote you played, but the extended one. But here's the bottom line. Shoring up state governments is actually one of the best things that stimulus money can do. We were just having a discussion about schools. Who funds the schools? State and local governments. It's great to talk about extra payments and extra money and folks that have lost their jobs. That really helps them. I don't want to minimize that. But states provide, and local governments, so many of the things like education and infrastructure that just allow us to send our kids to school and go to work, that backfilling those state budgets is actually one of the most beneficial things, not only to support our lives as we live them, but also to keep the economy on the rails that Congress could do.
And Lisa, as we take a look at this, and you're listening to your followers when it comes to the election right now, what are they asking for out of candidates?
I think a lot of people just want a better allocation of where the money is going. Mm-hmm. You hear about Trump and his buddies getting money from the PP, plan, and you hear about, oh, well, we're going broke in the states and stuff like that. But then you look at the stocks are going up. Boy, it's never looked better on Wall Street. So if it's looking good there, then we should be looking good, because that tells a lot about where our financial state is as a country. So if that's cool, then where is all that money going? Sure, I'd love it. I recently was a recipient of this check. It's good to have that extra monies. But then there was the whole thing about some of it was getting taken back out of bank accounts. So it's like, okay, if you're giving me this money, do I have to pay it back? Is this a loan? Are you giving this to me as a gift? Or is this something that you just want to say, I'm going to give you $2,000, now go spend it on something pretty, Wow.
A lot of questions there.
Yes.
And some of those questions, Michael, perhaps why there's been something of a backlash against some of the stimulus funding.
Oh, absolutely. The way a lot of the money was distributed was rather indiscriminate. So that you've got folks who are unemployed, for example, whose paycheck supports their families. Maybe a $600 boost a week, that sounds great. But this is how people are supporting their families, making their mortgage payments, paying their health insurance, and so on and so forth. That's not going to get the job done. On the other hand, there are folks who are fortunate enough not to have lost their jobs or had their hours cut that also received benefits from this. Now, that can still stimulate the economy, but the point is it was kind of thrown together, and it wasn't targeted. So we've got folks like restaurant industry employees that really, they're going to need way more support. They've lost their whole livelihoods. This doesn't even hardly touch it. And then we've got other folks that are like the ones invested in the stock market you were just talking about that maybe don't need the stimulus. But targeting takes time, and it takes government expertise. And in my opinion, we don't have enough of either.
And there is a lot of talk about that as they look at a second round of stimulus funds, talking about putting a cap at $40,000 for family income, that sort of thing. But that's probably something that the next generation of senators and Congress people are going to have to deal with. And we've talked about how heated the Republican race for Pat Roberts' Senate seat is here in Kansas. Candidates are now taking that heat to the airwaves, and a lot of you have been complaining. Cake's Jamie Jackson set out to find out if it's doing the candidates any good.
The race for U.S. Senate, like each passing summer day, continues to heat up, which is why we continue to see more and more political ads.
People complain about negative advertising, but it tends to work in the sense that it actually makes contrast between the candidates. And in the Republican primary right now for the Senate, there's very little issue difference between the major candidates.
Thus, the need to attack.
So what makes sense for them is to try to differentiate based upon character questions about other candidates.
I found them very vicious, very distasteful.
I've been trying to avoid them as much as possible. These days, I don't know what to believe. It's kind of hard to say or tell who's telling the truth and who's not.
I think you can campaign in a cleaner, more professional way than what they're doing.
Local TV stations are required to take campaign advertisements, and also they have to charge them at a lower rate.
Required by law. And as far as why candidates can make such outrageous or strong claims,
in the United States, the Supreme Court has been very protective of free speech in general, and especially in political speech.
And of course, these ads all aimed at the dyed-in-the-wool Republicans expected to vote in the primary. But you've got a lot of non-Republicans or middle-of-the-road Republicans that are seeing this, and they may or may not have the same reaction as we go into the general election.
You know, this is one thing that I'm not going to lie, I'm not really 100% on, but just from what I've noticed, me speaking personally, to me, it's like a bunch of banter. It's like a bunch of little kids trying to play that anything you can do, I can do better card. You know, it's like, oh, I want my time to shine, and nobody's really coming forward with a plan. I was talking to my husband about this a little bit ago last week, and we were talking about how nobody's coming with a plan. Everybody's coming with a bunch of rhetoric with who's going to go against who, and I'm going to badmouth this person, but you're not coming up with a solution. Why do I care if somebody thinks that Chris Kobach is doing his campaigns from Trump and getting all of that money and stuff to do his stuff? What do I care if they're trying to do the growth limited government thing and they're about fiscal conservation theory and stuff like that? I want to know what you're going to do to fix what's happening so that we can have a better America, better Kansas, better city, you know, all of that.
Michael, I'm going to send that question right on out to you. Why do candidates do this if voters are taking the attitude of, why do I care?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. Oftentimes negative advertising does work, and the dirty little secret of negative advertising is it's not what you think. It's not trying to get you to vote for the candidate. It's trying to get supporters of the other candidate not to vote, which is a horrible thing to do. But the traditional purpose of negative advertising is to lower the turnout of supporters of your opponents. Now, you've got negative ads running in a primary. And in my opinion, and this may not be a popular opinion, but hey, I'm a political scientist. When we weaken political parties, and I know we all say, oh, I vote for the party, not the person, and I'm sick and tired of these parties, and so on and so forth. But when we weaken political parties, you get these kinds of free-for-alls. What is the coordinated strategy among the Republican Party for the fall? I have no idea. I totally agree that with something you said, Pilar, earlier, which is that with these candidates attacking each other, it may be softening them up for Barbara Bollier in the fall.
And that has been a big concern within the mainstream Republican Party.
It absolutely has. Generally, they're backing Congressman Marshall, but the problem with Congressman Marshall is that he's got a little bit of pull in Wichita, even though that's not in the district he represents, but it's in the media market. But folks in Kansas City have never heard of him, and he's not getting that traction.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly we've discussed the Senate race for weeks and months, I think more than a year by now on this show, and we've still got a month to go before the primaries. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. There is one other story we want to talk about today that's gotten a little bit of attention, but could be a big game changer in Kansas. The Department of Children and Families has settled a class action lawsuit over the treatment of children in the state's child welfare system. The settlement will have DCF focusing on improvement in 3 areas: accountability, reporting and implementation, and improving outcomes. Kansas Appleseed filed the suit against the state in November of 2018, along with 2 other national groups. The suit came after a series of stories about abuse and neglect in the Kansas foster care system. It officially represented 10 to 12 kids still in the system. In this settlement, foster care agencies in Kansas must stop night-to-night, and short-term placements will no longer be able to house children in offices or hotels, and must make crisis intervention services, especially mental health evaluations, available to all children statewide. The organizations that brought the suit say this settlement is just a first step.
But of course, there are many, many other issues that the foster care system touches, or that touch the system and those kids. So yes, this is a first step.
The settlement requires yearly reports from the Department for Children and Families on foster care numbers, and the state must form an outside committee to oversee the foster care system. Now, the Wichita Eagle has opined that this could make the Kansas child welfare system one of the best in the nation. But there's a ways to go before we get there. Michael, this is not something that can be unpacked in a week or even a year.
No, it's not. It'd be a neat one for just to do a whole show on, and then maybe we could scratch the surface a little. Just speaking about public administration in general, this is a very common response. More oversight, more oversight. We're going to put this new oversight system in place. We're going to have outsiders review it. We're going to have timetables, accountability, and that's great. I'm not opposed to any of this. However, we have to keep in mind that the primary reason that the system is broken is because it's overwhelmed. It's overwhelmed with kids. They don't have enough money to pay social workers, and they have high turnover because the pay is so low. You can have all the oversight you want, and that's not going to fix that problem.
Well, I think a lot of that oversight, though, Michael, is because of the privatization of the foster care system here in Kansas. A lot of folks feeling like once the cases go to the private agencies, the state has no more idea of what's happening.
You are so right. I mean, we are in about 50 years now of this huge social experiment using nonprofits and grants to nonprofits to administer public policy. And foster care is one of the absolute best examples of that. And the different nonprofits operate differently. They're their own private organizations, but yet at the same time, they're supposed to be implementing public policy. So it makes the oversight harder. It makes some of these ideas a step in the right direction for sure. But the bottom line is they're still being asked to do more with less. And just once, I would like to hear some of these folks being asked to do more with more.
Lisa, I'm going to kind of wrap up with you. Your thoughts as you look at this. I mean, we've all watched for years the headlines going on here. What do you think is the biggest issue that needs to be fixed right now with DCF?
I think there needs to be less focus on the financial and more on the heart, like on the children. Speaking personally as someone who was in foster care, I was privileged enough to get adopted into a God-fearing family, and I was blessed from it. But seeing that my adopted parents got $2,000 for each of me and my siblings, and it was like they spent it on us, but others just are in it for the money. So therefore, you got children that are aging out, and mind you, as far as finances, I just found out recently that DCF actually has a college fund that they actually will pay the tuition of those foster children that are aging out of the system. But see, I didn't know this growing up when I was in that. So it's like a matter of we know where the money is, but we're going to hoard it for ourselves and get as many kids in there, and it turns into Miss Hannigan and Annie all over again. Well, certainly a different perspective. We appreciate you sharing that with us, Michael. We also appreciate you for being with us. We'd also like to thank our news partners, Cake News, KSN News, and the Wichita Eagle for sharing their materials with us. We'd love to continue the conversation with you online. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV or KPTS Channel 8 on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.